After Jesus died on the cross, the Roman soldiers took him down and gave him over to two men, one of them a Jewish leader who secretly followed Jesus. They prepared his body for burial by wrapping his body in strips of linen. Then they placed Jesus in a tomb. Because they worried that someone might steal his body, the Romans placed a huge stone in front of the tomb and guards outside of it. Then, the next day, Jesus' mother and a follower of Jesus named Mary went to visit the tomb of Jesus. Just as they had arrived, a huge earthquake shook the ground, and an angel came down from heaven and rolled back the stone from in front of the tomb and sat on it. The angel said to the women, "Do not be afraid. Jesus is not here. He is risen." So the women ran to tell Jesus' closest followers what they had heard. When they heard the news, Jesus' disciples, John and Peter, ran to the tomb to see for themselves. There, they found only the strips of linen that Jesus' body had been wrapped in. Mary, the follower of Jesus, stood outside the tomb crying. All of a sudden, a man appeared to her. She thought it was the gardener. But when he said her name, Mary, she realized it was Jesus. He was alive. This was the first of many times that Jesus appeared to his friends and followers. At one point, he even invited them to touch the nail scars in his hands so they would believe he was really alive. Not only did they believe that Jesus was alive, but many of them believed that he was the long-awaited Messiah, the one God had promised for years and years. But Jesus let them know that the story was not over yet. "Go and make disciples," Jesus told his followers. He commanded them to go throughout all the world to help others know about him and how to live in God's way. This began an adventure that would change the lives of Jesus' followers forever and change the world.
Imagine with me what it would look like if you were in a tomb, if you were lowered down into a grave. You look to your left and you look to your right, you look in front of you, you look behind you. It's nothing but dirt walls. It's way over your head. You can't jump high enough to get eye level above to see out, and you can't jump high enough to reach up and even grab onto the edge of the grave and pull yourself up and out.
You touch the dirt walls. It's damp and cold. Maybe you try to stick your hand in the dirt, try to carve out a place for your foot, and you put your foot in it, and you end up on your backside. And all you can see through the dirt walls, it's nothing but there's a nice rectangular picture of blue sky poking out right above where your walls are.
You're just too deep in the grave. You have no hope of getting yourself out. You can yell all you want. No one's going to come and help. You can cry all you want. No one is going to retrieve you from the abyss of the despair that you are in.
And I think this is where we find the followers of Jesus at the beginning of today's reading. They're in these metaphorical graves. Take, for instance, poor Mary Magdalene. She shows up. It's the worst possible thing you could imagine. She sees Jesus' tomb and it looks desecrated. You know, this isn't someone breaking a tombstone or putting graffiti on things. She looks in the tomb and Jesus' body is gone. Mary is brokenhearted. She's hysterical. She's in a tomb of mourning.
Peter and John, no different. Off on a foot race to get to the tomb, and what do they find there? Just what Mary had reported. An empty tomb. Where's Jesus? What happened to this big stone? How did it get rolled away? What's up with the guards? Where did they go? They were guarding the place. What's with the burial linens all folded up nice there to the side? It just doesn't make sense, and they are in a tomb of confusion.
And the disciples, they're gathering in the upper room. The doors are locked. The windows are locked. They're full of fear. They don't want anyone to get in. They don't want to stick their heads out the window. They don't want to stick their heads out the door. Why? Because the Jewish leaders are hunting them. And they're starting to hear these strange tales from the ladies that Jesus is back from the dead. The disciples find themselves buried by fear.
Thomas, so sure of the grip of death and not being able to shake that, knows that his friends and Mary and the other women surely were mistaken. They could not have seen Jesus. There's no coming back to life after death. Now, Jesus, he knows, had done that. Jesus had raised people from the dead. But this time, Jesus is dead. He can't raise himself. He's dead. There's no one else. There were no other Jesuses walking around seeing dead people and raising them up. It just wasn't going to happen. Jesus is in the tomb. And he is in a tomb of doubt, disbelief, and confusion.
So all these 4 examples from today's text, there are people walking around good old planet Earth. They're looking at the cross, looking at the grave. And they don't have the advantage that you and I have. They don't know how the story ends. They don't know the Easter story fully yet. They don't know that Jesus rose from the dead. And so they're seeing it unfold in a little different way than you and I, who know the ending.
Yeah, they don't see the cross as a pretty white one with a blue backstop on it, or even one like we've got up here with some white decorated around it and some nice Easter lilies at the base of it. They see the cross as an instrument of cruel torture, death, not a religious symbol as we have it today. The cross is a symbol of weakness, vulnerability, of suffering and death. For Mary and for all the disciples and all those who followed Jesus and had put their hope in Jesus. They thought it was something that defeated their friend.
And then they see the grave. And like many of us, when we see a cemetery, it reminded them of their own mortality. The grave is the final stop for someone. The grave is the period at the end of the sentence that is someone's life. If you're in the grave, it's over. You're done. Jesus is there. And so he's beaten.
This is where we find Mary and the disciples on the days that followed Good Friday, as their teacher and friend Jesus had been crucified. They were in their own graves of sadness, their own graves of fear, their own graves of doubt and sorrow and despair. They couldn't see the light of hope anywhere, and they were trapped.
We can all be trapped in graves sometimes. For instance, you hear of people whose loved ones have died. And inside, they themselves have stopped living life. They retreat inside themselves. They tune out the world. They tune out their friends. They tune out their family. Maybe their heart is still beating actual blood, but it's gone cold.
Maybe your grave is the painful reality of your mortality or your loneliness. Perhaps it's your body that is giving out. You don't need just new glasses, right? Or you don't need a little fiber in your diet, right? But you need a knee replacement, or you're looking at heart surgery, or something even more. It could be, maybe for you, the stillness that comes when you had a house full of children and now it's an empty nest. They've all flown the coop. Or maybe your painful reality is the noise of little feet that stomp about and the noisy voices that's just sometimes grates on your nerve. I mean, you love your kids, but the voices just in the constant noise just drive you a little crazy, and you just crave some peace and quiet in your life.
Maybe your grave, that place that you have no hope, that place that you can't get out of. Maybe your grave is something different. Maybe it's an addiction that helps you cope with that daily grind of life. Maybe your grave is the way you cover up fear and insecurity by staying so busy you don't have a moment to think. Maybe your grave is looking forward to death to free you from that cycle of life.
Or maybe you don't think you're in a grave at all. Maybe your life is so full of distractions and things that are grabbing your attention and keeping you so busy that you don't recognize that God is there in every part of your life.
But the reality is, the grave is not life. The grave you're trapped in, where you can't even see the grave. That's one you're helpless in. You're unable to get out. You can't even see that there's a problem going on.
And we all have living times at some point in our lives of living in graves. And we need to be raised out of them. Just like Mary and the disciples needed to be raised up. And because of Easter, where Jesus broke out of the tomb and rose to new life, we have hope.
The empty cross, the cross where Jesus once hung, now stands as a reminder to us, not of death and torture, but that God entered our darkness. He entered our despair, and He embraces us. But then Jesus' empty tomb reminds us that God defeats our darkness and our despair. Those very things that we think have beaten us, those are the things that God defeats on Easter.
We see this when Jesus embraced Mary in her tomb, her grave of sadness. She's in the garden. She thought Jesus was a gardener. And yet Jesus comes to her and says, "Why are you crying?" Jesus stood with her in her pain and her tears. And she realized that when Jesus was alive, the only way she realized it is when she heard Jesus speak her name. Mary. And she had hope. Jesus had just raised her up out of her grave and lifted her out of that grave.
We see this when Jesus embraces His friends, the friends who were locked away in that upper room tomb. They're locked away in their fear. And Jesus comes to them and He speaks these words, "Peace be with you." Just as Jesus was raised up out of His grave, Jesus comes and raises His friends out of their grave of fear.
We see this when Jesus comes to Thomas. He could only feel the cool, cold dirt walls of death. Thomas was so buried so deeply that he couldn't look up to even see the sky. Jesus comes to him and says, look at my hands. Look at my side. Look at my feet. Stop doubting and believe." And at that moment, Jesus carries Thomas up out of his grave as Thomas looks up and sees Jesus face to face.
That is the victory of Christ's empty cross and His empty tomb. The empty cross is God's embrace, showing us that He understands darkness and despair. And the empty tomb is showing that God can bring victory to us, even when we're in darkness and despair and pain and suffering. The cross shows that God understands our tombs, and the empty tomb shows that He defeats our tombs. And just like Jesus called Mary's name, Jesus calls out your name. Because no matter what your grave is like, the Easter message for you is this: there is hope.
There is hope for you. There's hope for us. No matter what we are going through in life, there is hope for you no matter where you have been. There is hope for you no matter how bad or how good your life looks. There's hope that lifts us up and allows us to live a full life here. Because of the hope that Jesus gives us, we can love God and love others freely. Because of hope that Jesus gives us, we can trust in God to care for us. Because of the hope that Jesus gives us, we can see God in all things, both good and bad.
This hope of new life allows us to look at the world and see God everywhere.
Like in the home,
Or in the forest,
in the face of a child,
in the sunset,
in the hands worn down by work,
in the ghetto,
in human love,
in the enemy,
in the mountains,
in the suburbs,
in solitude,
in the Super Bowl,
in marriage,
in violence,
in the factory,
in the culture,
in the cry of the poor,
in the beauty of the sea,
in the sharing of food,
in the dancing,
in the cancer ward,
in the revolution,
in the opera,
in the corporation,
in the prison,
in the sunshine,
in the hospital,
in the rain and in the snow,
in the commerce,
in the government,
in the aged,
in our vocations,
in the dying,
in the lab,
in the torture chamber,
in death row,
in our daily food,
in the broken home,
in the air,
on the reservation,
in the office,
in the stranger,
in the church,
in the newspaper,
in outer space,
in the third world,
in death.
in all of life.
And as we see hope, the hope of the empty cross and the empty tomb, in all areas of life, we live with Jesus. And there is our Easter victory. Alleluia! Alleluia! Alleluia!
Amen.
Amen.